As someone who grew up in the same town, Casper, went to the same high school, enjoyed the same wide-open spaces, I can't think of anybody who better embodied Wyoming values than Dick Cheney. He was comfortable in the saddle on horseback. He judged people by what they accomplished and what they stood for. He loved the state where he grew up and met Lynn. And Wyoming loved him back, electing him 6 times to the House of Representatives. He enjoyed the solitude of the Wyoming wilderness, too, and was an expert at finding the best places to deploy a fly rod. In fact, if you wanted his attention in the office and you saw that the Orvis catalog was open on his desk, you knew to come back some other time. For my 50th birthday, he offered to let me come with him for a day's fly fishing in the Tetons. I told him that the best gift I could give in return was to respectfully decline because I'm no fisherman, and I knew that if I spoke even 10 words all day, he would say I talk too much. When I was his press secretary, I once wrote a news release that contained the word bureaucrat. He crossed it out and substituted federal official. As the son of a man who worked for the Agriculture Department, he respected people who chose to serve their country. Many Americans got their first look at Dick Cheney during the Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. My office at the Pentagon was the place where letters made their first stop, and one in particular stands out in my memory. A woman in Indiana wrote to say this: "During these difficult times for our country, it is reassuring to turn on the television and see someone in charge of our military who is plain speaking, resolute, and strong." And then she added, "I find these qualities to be very attractive. I'm not sure whether you're married, but if you're ever in Indianapolis, you can look me up." I showed this letter to Secretary Cheney, and he took it home to brag about it. Shortly after Dick Cheney became Secretary of Defense, one of our senior policy officials had a request for me as the Pentagon spokesman. A New York Times reporter wanted to know more about a new effort by the George H.W. Bush administration to reach a nuclear weapons agreement with the Soviet Union. The official sought permission to give the Times some background. I relayed the request to Secretary Cheney, who gave his okay, but he said, "Make absolutely sure our guy talks it over with the White House first to get a clear idea of what he can say." The following Sunday morning, the paper revealed that the president would soon propose a new negotiating tactic. The problem was that the president planned to reveal that strategy in a speech on Monday, and he was none too pleased to see it spelled out beforehand. I received a call at home on Sunday informing me that this official and I were to report to Secretary Cheney's office first thing Monday morning. We walked in and sat down, braced for the worst. The secretary said, "I've got some good news and some bad news. Which do you want first?" So I asked for the bad news. He looked at us sternly and he said, "The bad news is that the President of the United States is very angry with you both." And then I asked for the good news and he said, "I only have to fire one of you." I could tell he was joking. I'm not sure the senior official realized it. And then Secretary Cheney said, "It's okay, guys. I told the president it was my idea." He could have told President Bush that it was our fault, but he took the blame and saved us from ourselves. When the boss that you serve cleans up after your mistakes, you can bet that inspires loyalty. And Dick Cheney demonstrated that kind of decency and concern for all the people who served him during his more than 40 years in public life. In 1991, a magazine planned to run a story outing me. I knew it was coming, so I went up to his office and offered to resign. He wouldn't hear of it. And for several days after that article appeared, he would call me on the direct line to my desk at the Pentagon to ask how I was doing and to tell me to get on with the job. Washington attracts ambitious people driven by a desire to serve their country. But many of those who become big names acquire staffers and then cast them aside as they rise in stature. Not Dick Cheney. Throughout his life, on his steady rise through the corridors of power, his circle of friends kept growing. He did not abandon those who helped him along the way. And when George W. Bush chose him to be the vice presidential candidate in 2000, their first campaign stop together was Casper, a demonstration of Dick's loyalty to his home state. I don't think he was worried about locking up Wyoming's 3 electoral votes. Those of us fortunate to work for him knew that he had a sly sense of humor. He loved to tell a story about attending a political event when he ran for re-election as Wyoming's congressman. He said he walked up to one old rancher, stuck out his hand, and said, "I'm Dick Cheney, I'm running for Congress, and I'd like to have your vote." And the rancher replied, "You got it. That guy we got in there now is no damn good." In my 7 years of working for him in the Congress and at the Pentagon, I seldom came away from a meeting with him without thinking that I'd learned something about politics and government. Lynn captured that experience perfectly when she introduced him at the 2000 Republican Convention. Here's what she said. "Conversations with Dick have a way of taking unexpected turns. Problems get redefined, and you find yourself thinking about things in new ways." And she added, "I cannot imagine the discussion that would not benefit from his presence." Dick Cheney was a good and decent man. He loved his family and his home state. His highest aspiration was serving the country, and I'm so lucky and so deeply grateful that I was along for part of that ride.
Lynn, Liz, and Mary, and all the Cheney family, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate this chance to say a few words about a man I was proud to call my vice president and my friend. Though not a happy assignment, I do consider it an easy one, because there was so much to like and admire about Dick Cheney. Dick was a stoical man, and I doubt he left his life with any complaints about the time given to him or its end. He was also a grateful man, grateful above all for 3 loyal, loving women who shared in his journey. As I quickly discovered in 2000, when you choose one Cheney, you get 4. His busy and purposeful life was an adventure they experienced together. In a family so close, you dread the day when the circle is broken. Lynn and the girls, Heather, Phil, and all the grandchildren, he sure loved you all, and he was proud of his family. I hope it helps to know that many people in this country share your sense of loss, and we're here today as your friends. 25 years ago, I had a big choice to make, a big job to fill. I want to know all my options, so I enlisted the help of a distinguished former White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of Defense to lead my search for running mate. Dick Cheney and I went through the files name by name. We talked over the various qualities I was looking for in a vice president: preparedness, mature judgment, rectitude, and loyalty. Above all, I wanted someone with the ability to step into the presidency without getting distracted by the ambition to seek it. After weeks of these meetings, I began to have a thought I could not shake. I realized the best choice for the vice president was the man sitting right in front of me, and I told him that. At such a moment, most in this position would have jumped at the chance, but Dick stayed detached, and he analyzed it. Before I made my decision, he insisted on giving me a complete rundown of all the reasons I should not choose him. He also heard one of my top advisors was against the choice, so Dick invited him to make the case. As he did so, he sat there unfazed and expressionless. In the end, I trusted my judgment. I remember my dad's words when I told him what I was planning. He said, "Son, you couldn't pick a better man." The way this all unfolded followed a pattern in Dick Cheney's life. Summing up his career a few years ago, he said, "A few breaks came my way, and one job always led to another, and in a life that's taken me far to more places than I ever expected. That was Dick's typically understated version of events, but there's a little more to the story. His abilities were self-evident without need of calculation or self-promotion. His talent and restraint exceeded his ego. Even before the Cheney name reached the national stage, people always saw something in the man, solid, reliable, and rare. One of the first to really notice was Lynn Vincent. She can recall a time in their college years when Dick, as he freely admitted, lacked direction and needed some straightening out. I think we had that in common. That was Lynn's kind of project, and it did not take her long. He said many times that his life would have turned out a whole lot different if he had never met her. It may explain how in just over a decade a guy can go from laying transmission lines outside Cheyenne to serving as chief of staff of the President of the United States. In Dick's telling, those years working for Gerald Ford were special and formative. He cherished the association, and the high regard went both ways. In his memoir, President Ford described Dick's steadiness, his low-key style, and his absolute loyalty. I know exactly what he meant. These are not traits easy to come by in Washington. Being calm, reticent, undramatic, and untrustworthy are not everyone's formula for success in politics. But they were the Cheney way, and they worked. I'm reminded of a renowned senator who once gave this advice to a junior colleague. Perhaps he said you could occasionally allow yourself the luxury of an unexpressed thought. Dick Cheney was like that, sparing and measured with words. In a profession that attracts talkers, he was a thinker and a listener. And when he did speak up, conveying thoughts in that even tone of voice, that orderly, unexcitable manner, you knew you were getting the best of a highly disciplined mind. No colleague, no legislator, no foreign leader who ever met Dick Cheney ever doubted that they were dealing with a serious man. Of course, not every political counselor is cut out to be a political candidate. But Dick Cheney put himself to the test and never lost an election. In fact, it happens that he and I both ran for Congress in 1978. And let me just say the Republican wave didn't reach West Texas that year. He told me a few times what it's like to campaign in Wyoming. Lots of small gatherings and long drives. It's easy to imagine the impression that young Dick Cheney made when he was asking for the vote. I wish more Americans got to know Dick Cheney the way the folks in Casper, Cody, and Laramie got to know him. Smart and polished, without airs. Courteous and approachable, seeing everyone as an equal, a gentleman by nature, and a true man of the West. Dick was funny and easygoing in a style that his public image never caught up with. Though we can all agree he wasn't your standard issue politician. If any voters came hoping for a kind word and a hug, they'd have to settle for the kind word. But you can't question the appeal of the only person from America's Mountain West ever elected to national office. On that score, history should record that I chose my vice president not once, but twice. In 2004, he offered to step aside in case I wanted to replace him. I thought about it for a while, but after 4 years of seeing how he treated people, how he carried responsibility, how he handled pressure and took the hits, I arrived back at the conclusion that they do not come any better than Dick Cheney. Colleagues from every chapter of his career will tell you that he lifted the standards of those around him just by being who he was, so focused and so capable. In our years in office together, on the quiet days and on the hardest ones, he was everything a president should expect in his second in command. In moments of testing, Dick Cheney was the model of concentration, alertness, and composure. His memoir was titled My Time. His time produced an old breed of public servant, defined by their substance and character. This was a vice president totally devoted to protecting the United States and its interests. There was never any agenda or angle beyond that. You did not know Dick Cheney unless you understood his greatest concerns and ambitions were for his country. Across 40 years, his service was consistent, faithful, and noble. All in all, not a bad showing for a career and a life, especially when you consider his sheer physical endurance. As Dr. Rayner pointed out, he became an authority on cardiovascular disease and a marvel at what resourceful doctors and one very determined patient can accomplish. Dick had faced down fears and hardships, but he really didn't speak about them. The reward was more of a life than he ever expected, including 7 grandchildren to complete the picture. One of them, Richard, even asked his grandfather to attend kindergarten class for a show and tell. I wish I'd have been there. As a matter of fact, the teacher told Dick that was the most exciting show and tell since the morning a little girl brought her cow to class. That might have been amongst Dick's last moments in the spotlight. In his final years, he was content to go his way. At a rare public appearance in 2022, he offered a kind of parting reflection. He said, when you can look back on a lifetime in politics and government, and what you value most are the friendships, then I guess you've done all right. A lot of us know that feeling as we say an affectionate farewell to the 46th Vice President of the United States. It's something to be cherished when a man of his caliber has been your colleague and friend. The son of Wyoming, son of Marjorie and Richard Cheney of Casper, went far in this world and in our own lives left a very fine mark. We are grateful for his good life, we honor his service, and we pray that somewhere up the trail we will meet him again.
Following your kids to talk about your dad is not good scheduling. But distinguished guests, presidents and vice presidents, dear friends, my mom and Mary and I and our families, thank you for being here to honor the good and great man we loved so much. A few years ago, reflecting back on nearly 40 years in public service, Dick Cheney said this: "The path I had traveled was partly due to the circumstance of my birth. Not that I had been born into a powerful or privileged family, I wasn't. But I was born an American, a blessing surely among life's greatest." My dad thought deeply about what this blessing meant, about the duties it imposed. Shortly after he became Secretary of Defense in 1989, he described departing from the Pentagon. "As my helicopter lifted off the Pentagon helipad, I could look across the river to the great monuments of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, to the White House and the Capitol building, where all the great decisions that have shaped 200 years of American history were made. And I could look directly out on Arlington National Cemetery and remember what a terrible price thousands of brave Americans have paid so that all of us could enjoy the blessings of liberty." My dad's devotion to America was deep and substantive. He spent his life studying the history of our great republic. He knew you couldn't truly appreciate what it means to live in freedom if you didn't understand the sacrifices of the generations who came before. And he made sure that his children and grandchildren understood this too. When Mary and I were little, my dad would load up our station wagon on the weekends to take us to visit Civil War battlefields. With the back seat down and no need for seatbelts in those days, we would stretch out, eating Krispy Kreme donuts for breakfast, while my dad drove us to places like Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Manassas. To be clear, even with the donuts, Mary and I were not enthusiastic participants in these outings. As you might imagine, Dick Cheney read every word of every sign at every battlefield, museum, and national park he ever visited. When you're 5 or 6 years old, this is not your idea of a good time. Mary and I usually moaned and groaned about how long he was taking, and Dick Cheney ignored us. And he just kept reading the signs. He didn't lecture us or demand that we read anything, but we pretty quickly realized no one was going anywhere until he got done. And so we figured we might as well start reading the signs too. And what an education we got. That was the thing about Dick Cheney. He wouldn't force his opinion on you or demand you do things his way. He might not share his opinion at all if you didn't ask. In fact, he was known to go long stretches of time without saying a single word. But if you watched closely, if you asked questions, if you listened when he did speak, you had the experience of seeing the world opening up in front of you, of looking at things in new ways, of benefiting from his clarity of thought, his ability to crystallize what was important and what wasn't. And he was always surprising. Many know the story of his time at Yale. If my dad heard you say he flunked out, he would correct you. No, I was asked to leave. Twice. He took a break from school and he spent several years building power line across the West. I had heard this part of the story my whole life, but it wasn't until I worked with him on his memoirs that I learned how he spent his evenings. At the end of long days, he'd unroll his sleeping bag by a campfire or on a cot in the cook tent, and by the light of his Coleman lantern, he read Winston Churchill's 6-volume history of World War II. By the fall of 1963, Dick Cheney was convinced, some would say threatened, by my mother to return to school. He'd been at the University of Wyoming just a few weeks when he climbed to a seat up near the rafters of the packed field house to hear President John F. Kennedy urge the students to dedicate their lives to the service of our nation. I think this is the moment my dad decided what direction his life should take. Though he was inspired to service by President Kennedy, Dick Cheney became a Republican. But he knew that bonds of party must always yield to the single bond we share as Americans. For him, a choice between defense of the Constitution and defense of your political party was no choice at all. When he was vice president, he wrote in this letter to all of his grandchildren, "As you grow, you will come to understand the sacrifices that each generation makes to preserve freedom and democracy for future generations. And you will assume the important responsibilities of citizens in our society. I ask of you as my grandchildren what I asked of my daughters, that you always strive in your lives to do what is right." In the last few years, God gave me one of the greatest blessings of my life, the gift of time with my dad. We spent hours sitting by the fire at his house or mine, watching football and old movies. We went to grandkids' games and matches, and we hit the road again, this time with me in the driver's seat. Now, let me be clear, he did not like my driving. And in his defense, I had wrecked far too many of his cars over the years for him to be happy with this arrangement. But we reached an accommodation of sorts. My dad agreed to let me drive if I agreed to let him choose the music. Johnny Cash, John Denver, and yes, even the Carpenters were the soundtrack of our road trips. We went to places he'd taken us 50 years ago, to Manassas and Antietam and Mount Vernon. My dad in his Stetson, the latest copy of The Economist, that day's newspapers, and a book always tucked into the door pocket. We drove for hours. We talked about life and family, history, and America. Sometimes my dad's yellow lab, Max, would jump in the back seat and come with us. Max, like every dog we ever had, loved my dad the best. To be in my dad's company was to know safety and love and laughter and kindness. There's a picture taken several years ago of him in his cowboy hat and jeans, in a fleece jacket. He has his arm around one of his young grandsons, who's leaning into his warm embrace. Looking at that picture last week, my mom put it best when she said that's what he was to all of us. He was a giant to the end, a lion of a man who loved and served this great republic. The night before my dad died, the sky above my parents' house filled with clouds in the shape of winged angels. I'd never seen anything like it. It seemed indeed that angels and archangels and all the company of heaven had come to watch over him. As my dad left this earth, his last words were to tell my mother he loved her. And now, all of us who loved him so dearly say to him, "Good night, sweet dad. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest."